mientras comenzamos, pueden ir a la encuesta y contestar. Esta noche vamos a estar ofreciendo interpretación en vivo a español. Dentro de unos segundos se va a activar la opción de interpretación simultánea y van a ver en la parte de abajo de su pantalla un icono del mundo o un globo. Le pueden dar clic ahí, pueden elegir el idioma que prefieren. Una vez que elijan el idioma de su preferencia, pueden seleccionar silenciar el audio original. De esa forma solo estarán escuchando al intérprete. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you, Beatrice, for being here. Beatrice Trujillo has been with us for all of our events, and thank you so much for serving as our translator. A reminder again, we have the pre-survey, but it's my honor now to introduce Cristina Cuevas, who is the chair of the board subcommittee for our name exploration process.
Good evening, and thank you for joining for this final presentation in a series of community events examining the origins and the impact of naming our college after Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. Before we begin, I want to provide a little background on why we're hosting the name exploration events and what we hope to achieve by engaging with you. In July 2020, the Cabrillo College Board of Trustees received a request to rename the college in response to widespread national social unrest in response to the death of George Floyd, and also critical analysis of the college's namesake. Recognizing the concerns of our faculty, staff, students, and administrators, we established a process to explore that request. The board created a subcommittee to explore the name of the college and eventually to recommend to the full board a proposal as to whether or not the name should be changed. The subcommittee then assembled a task force to create a process for exploring this type of institutional change request. The process includes this series of public events to learn more about the history of the namesake, the decision to name the college after him, and how his legacy is affecting the community we serve. Our subcommittee has been guided by a commitment to the mission of the college, to research-based decision-making, and to engaging widespread input from our campus stakeholders as well as the larger community. Ultimately, what we learn together through these events, coupled with community feedback, will help us formulate our recommendation regarding the request to change the name of the college or not. So please note, though, that the board will not be making a final decision on this issue until the fall semester of 2021. There are other community listening sessions that we will be scheduling later this year to engage students and the college community members, as well as the larger community, in a series of listening sessions. We invite you now to join us in learning more and encourage your comments and questions to our event via the pre and post event surveys. Now back to you, Dr. Wetstein.
Well, thank you, Christina. Thank you to Adam Spickler, who's also a member of the committee, for your leadership in this process. I also want to extend thanks tonight to our history faculty for recommending tonight's guest speaker, and particularly also Enrique Buelna, one of our history faculty, and Victoria Bañalas, one of our English faculty, for the recommendation. Really appreciate their efforts to participate in this process. So welcome again. I'm Matt Wetstein, the president of Cabrillo, and I just have some brief introductory reminders for the format for tonight. So before we begin, a couple of ground rules. We do want to remind everyone that our lectures are recorded. So if you know folks who are unable to attend tonight, they will be available on our name exploration website, and I'll post that link in a moment. We also have the pre and post survey. So towards the end of the talk, when we do the question and answer session, I'll be posting a link to a survey for you to offer your insights on the name exploration process then as well. So please take a moment to complete those surveys if you have a chance to do so. Also, tonight's presentation is in webinar style format. So you'll find that you're muted while we have the guest lecturer here to present. If you have specific questions, we encourage you to put those into the Q&A box down at the bottom of the Zoom screen, either in English or Spanish. and Dr. Resendez will answer the questions from the chat or from the Q&A as we get to the end of the talk. So now it's my pleasure to do an introduction of our guest speaker, Dr. Andres Resendez. Dr. Resendez is a professor of history at UC Davis. He earned his doctorate in history from the University of Chicago after earning a master's degree there and after completing a bachelor's degree in international relations from El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. He grew up there in Mexico City, and that's also where he went into politics briefly and also served as a consultant for historical soap operas. After earning his PhD, he has taught at various universities, Yale University, the University of Helsinki briefly, and now, of course, at UC Davis. His service at the University of Helsinki was in conjunction with a Fulbright Fellowship as the Bicentennial Chair of American Studies in 2008-2009. His research specializes on early European exploration and colonization of the Americas, the US-Mexico border region, and the early history of the Pacific, particularly the pioneering voyages of discovery and the biological exchanges across the largest ocean on Earth. In addition to a wide variety of peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Resendez is the author of 4 important books, including Changing National Identities at the Frontier, Texas and New Mexico from 1800 to 1850, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2005. He's also the author of A Land So Strange, The Epic Journey of Cabeza de Vaca from 2007. And in 2016, he published the book that is the feature of his lecture tonight, The Other Slavery. The book was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Bancroft Prize, and won the Bancroft Prize in History from Columbia University. Later this year, he will publish his latest work, a book called Conquering the Pacific, An Unknown Mariner and the Final Great Voyage of the Age of Discovery, coming out later in September, I believe. This past academic year, Dr. Resendez has been the recipient of a distinguished Andrew Carnegie Mellon Fellowship for his work on the Magellan Project. And so it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to the Cabrillo community, Dr. Andres Resendez.
Thank you so much, Matthew Wetstein. Thank you for proposing my name for this honor. It is really a privilege and an honor to be here in this key moment in this renaming process that you are engaged in. I will talk about the phenomenon of Indian slavery. Sorry, let me just put this. The phenomenon of Indian slavery, which is something that was not widely known up until a few years ago, but I would say in the last 2 decades or so, there's been an increasing interest in this topic. It remains the case that in novels and movies, like the ones that I'm showing you on the screen, the notion that slavery is closely linked to African slavery remains, and we remain wedded to this narrative. However, many of us are increasingly aware that this is a phenomenon that went well beyond Africans and African Americans. And so indeed, in my recent book, I explore these other system of bondage that targeted Native Americans. It was a system that was every bit as terrible, degrading, and vast as African slavery, and remains somewhat unknown, even though, as I said, that is changing rapidly. According to my estimates, anywhere between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans were enslaved between 1492 and 1900, when these phenomenon really declined. And interestingly, in contrast to African slavery, which targeted mostly adult males, the majority of Native American slaves were women and children. And we can explore why that is the case. It was something, a little bit of a mirror image of African slavery. This was a very big deal, but somehow we have chosen to forget all about it. And you can see that in the amount of publications, in the amount of movies, novels, etc. When we talk about slavery, virtually no one ever thinks about Native Americans. It is as if each group could fit only into one category, so into one historical box. Africans were the ones enslaved, while Native Americans died off or were dispossessed and confined to reservations. Now, I have to start out by emphasizing that Indian slavery was not a European invention. This had gone on in the Americas for millennia, as far as we can peer in the archaeological and the historical record, etc. And we have many examples of this. Mayas and Aztecs took captives to use as sacrificial victims. Iroquois people replaced their dead by engaging with what became known as mourning wars to replace deceased relatives. In the Pacific Northwest, marriages culminated with the exchange of slaves. I mean, elite marriages between indigenous couples culminated with the exchange of these slaves. So this was something that had gone on. And so here I'm just by way of illustration, I could show you 1,000 images is the beautiful Bonampak murals in the Maya region in Yucatan. Well, this is actually in Chiapas, showing Maya lords clearly standing over what are clearly slave captives. And here we have, I'm showing you a codex. It's true, it's post-conquest, it's circa 1541, but the pictorial convention was so obvious that really the way to depict captives was by somebody being held by the hair. And so if you can read the gloss, which I'll try to point here, cautivo, over here and over here, you can see that these warriors, these Aztec warriors, were represented as holding these captives, which was so common. So it existed before 1492, but with the arrival of Europeans, these pre-existing practices of bondage, originally embedded in specific cultural contexts, such as the ones I have briefly described, became commercialized, expanded in unexpected ways, and came to resemble in the fullness of time the kinds of human trafficking that we recognize today as slavery. This transformation began with the earliest European explorers. So during the second voyage of Columbus in 1493, the Admiral of the Ocean Sea sent dozens of Native Americans from the Caribbean. And let me just quote a line from him just to give you a little flavor to get a sense of how they thought about these. He said in this letter addressed to the Spanish monarchs, "May your highnesses judge whether these Indians ought to be captured, for I believe we could take many of the males every year and an infinite number of women. And may you also believe that one of them would be worth more than 3 black slaves from Guinea in strength and ingenuity, as you will gather from the ones that I'm shipping out now." And we can go back again in the question and answer as to why Columbus believed these were better slaves. These Native Americans made better slaves than African slaves. But the point is that thus Columbus inaugurated the Middle Passage, complete with the overcrowding and high mortality rates that we commonly associate with African slavery, but which in fact can be traced back to this earlier other slavery, as I call it. Now, eventually all European powers became important participants in the Indian slave trade. The English, the French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. But Spain, by virtue of the enormous and densely populated colonies that it ruled, became the dominant slaving power. Spain was to Indian slavery what Portugal and later England were to African slavery. And ironically, Spain began by forbidding the enslavement of Native Americans. Yet this categorical prohibition did not stop generations of determined conquistadors and settlers and colonists from taking native slaves on truly a planetary scale, from the eastern seaboard of the United States to the tip of South America, and from the Canary Islands all the way to the Philippines, which were a Spanish colony during much of the colonial period. And the fact that this other slavery had to be carried out clandestinely made it even more insidious. So really, this is a tale of good intentions gone badly astray. The Caribbean was the laboratory of conquest, the first home of the Spanish in the New World. And it was also the first and quite likely the worst native slaving ground in the world. At contact, the Caribbean sustained a large indigenous population. And there are different estimates, and we can discuss about that. But what is beyond doubt is that from this very high point, whatever the high point may be, there was a tragic demographic collapse. By the 1550s, merely 2 generations after contact, the natives so memorably described by Columbus as, and I quote him, affectionate and without malice, or another quote, having very straight legs and no bellies, had ceased to exist as a people. There were a few bands of runaways, but it had ceased to exist as a people. They had ceased to exist as an organized people. As any school child knows, smallpox was a major reason for this devastation. But blaming everything on unintended biological consequences is just too easy and not borne out by the sources. If you actually read the sources, the 16th century sources, you will see a great deal about destruction, hunger, etc. And we can also take very specific examples. Take, for example, the island of Hispaniola or Española, which is the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic that appears right in the middle of your screen right there. And I have an expanded version of it. Italian demographer Massimo Livi Bacci has recently, or a few years ago, made the crucial point that the first certain documentation of smallpox in Hispaniola appears only in 1518. And yet, even though 26 years passed before the first documented cases of smallpox began to appear, the native population of the Caribbean found itself already on a clear path towards extinction. At contact, Hispaniola may have had a population that we can reasonably estimate at around 200,000, perhaps 300,000 inhabitants. Very recent DNA evidence conducted this year has put the number even smaller than that. But regardless, again, of the initial number, 100,000, etc., by 1508, that figure had fallen to 60,000 people. And by 1514, it stood at merely 26,000 people, according to a fairly comprehensive census and no longer guesswork. By 1517, the number had plunged to just 11,000 Native Americans. So in other words, 1 year before Europeans began reporting smallpox, smallpox in Hispaniola, the indigenous population of this very large island had dwindled to anywhere between 10 and perhaps 2% of what it had been in 1492. Of course, it is impossible to rule out completely the possibility of unreported epidemics earlier on. But it is also the case that other factors were at work in the early years. As it turns out, Hispaniola possessed the largest gold deposits in the Circum-Caribbean region. And Spanish settlers of this island quickly put the local residents to work. And so here, just to give you a sense, so this is Hispaniola. This is the first Spanish settlement on the north coast. And this is the first foray that did into the interior of Hispaniola. This is a fort that they built called Santo Tomas. And this region around here in the valley of Cibao is where they found these gold deposits, early gold deposits. And we know quite a bit about what went on because the most prolific early chronicler, who was also a gold prospector, Oviedo, wrote extensively about it. And this image, well, this is Oviedo's text that included some sketches, including this beautiful one, which shows three figures that gives you a sense of the tasks involved in these first gold rush of the continent that unfolded pretty much between 1500 and 1510. So the figure on the right-hand side shows so these groups were called cuadrillas in Spanish, and it could consist of either three individuals or a multiple of these three. So three groups of varying sizes doing these three basic tasks. So the task on the right was to dig superficially, usually close to a river or a stream of some kind. The second group, shown in this figure in the middle, transported these sand, from where it was being dug out to the stream. And the third group, oftentimes women, would receive these large pans, wooden pans called bateas, and they would submerge them in the river and move them around so that the sand would be washed away, and what few nuggets at the very bottom would remain. And that was the gold, whatever God, as they put it, whatever God willed to give us. So this is the way the process worked. And it sounds innocuous enough, except that if you do this for 14, 16, 17, 18 hours a day, it resulted in the exhaustion of the indigenous peoples forced to do this. And also it prevented them from doing everything else that they needed to do, especially growing food. And so the result was a first great devastation, of which there is no doubt. I mean, demographic devastation, of which there is no doubt. And as I said, this devastation predated the first reports, large-scale reports of smallpox, the deadliest of the epidemics. So clearly some stuff other than the epidemics was going on before the epidemics. We also know that from Española or Hispaniola, this large island, and from other other nearby islands, mainly Puerto Rico and Jamaica, we have slaving expeditions being launched. And the reason for that is because the number of workers in the island of Hispaniola had plunged to such an extent that they were no longer sufficient to obtain the gold from the gold mines in Hispaniola. And so indigenous peoples from other outlying islands had to be brought into Hispaniola. So I built this map on the basis of some of the, before you could actually launch one of these slaving expeditions, and I'll explain, it was, so generally Indian slavery, as I said, was prohibited, but there were a few exceptions to the rule. So for example, if you found Indians who were cannibalistic, they could be legally enslaved. The idea being that cannibalism was such a terrible sin that extraordinary measures needed to be taken in order to correct that sin, to punish that sin. Or for example, if there were Native Americans who held other Native Americans as slaves, it was legal to quote unquote ransom such slaves. And again, the logic was that these slaves would be much better in the hands of a Spanish Christian overlord than in the hands of a pagan Native American master. And of course, there were also cases of rebellion or violence against Spanish settlers, in which case it was possible to hold those slaves to enslave those slaves and keep them legally as your property. So because of these loopholes to the general prohibition, it was possible to organize these slaving expeditions. And you can see that they pretty much radiated out these slaving wave all across the Caribbean. So for example, the Bahamas, the Bahama Islands, which were called the Lucayas by the Spanish, the early Spanish, Sometimes they were also known as the useless islands because these islands had nothing of value, according to the Spanish, except human beings. And so the idea was that they should be transported to the islands where there was nothing to exploit and bring them to where they could become valuable in the service of the Spanish monarchy, extracting gold or in some other occupation. Now, gold was the initial impetus for procuring large amounts of indigenous labor, but really silver was the ultimate slaving activity in the Americas. And in the United States, and especially in California, when we think about gold and silver and precious metals, the unavoidable reference is to the California gold rush. And so I wanted to put sort of to give you a sense of the perspective that we're talking about. So this is the California gold rush in this graph here. And this is the silver, the much earlier silver rush that I would like to say a few words about. Altogether, so if we just begin with the stuff that we know altogether, California produced some 3.7 million kilograms of gold, and in the process attracted some 300,000 people from the rest of the world. It was clearly a major phenomenon, yet the exploitation of silver was a much bigger deal, and we again seem to have forgotten much about it. First of all, in terms of duration, as you can see from the charts, it really started out in the 1520s. It grew through the 70s, through the 16th century. It kind of plateaued in the 17th century, and then it got a second wind in the 18th century. So by the second half of the 18th century, the silver mines of northern Mexico were in many years producing over half of all the silver produced in the entire world. So these were big operations that required a lot of work. And here's again a sense of where they were. Typically, when you read about the silver mines of Mexico, sometimes you kind of imagine just a couple of mines. People also tend to think of the silver mines of northern Mexico, but in fact, this silver boom began in central Mexico and southern Mexico, where Cortez, the conqueror of Mexico, was the largest Indian slaver and the biggest developer of the early silver mines in central and southern Mexico. And eventually, this was a business that spread along the western coast and up until the high plains of what is now north central Mexico, where some of the largest mines in the world existed. This silver boom ended up producing 44.2 million kilograms of silver, or about 12 times as much metal as the gold produced in California. So to get a sense, what you need to imagine is 12 gold rushes strung out in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries to get a sense of what we're talking about. If this fantastic silver boom had occurred in the 19th century, like the California gold rush, Mexico would have become a worldwide magnet. In an era of newspapers, steamboats, and widespread transoceanic travel, there is little doubt that the great silver mines of Mexico would have lured immigrants from all the quarters of the world. But because these boom predated all of these communication and transportation conveniences and unfolded at a time when the Spanish monarchy actually prohibited all foreigners from going to the silver districts, Mexico had to do with its own human resources, especially Native Americans. So California attracted 300,000 people from the rest of the world, yet colonial Mexico had to satisfy 12, 13, 14 of those, and each of them requiring a hugely greater labor demand with no access to volunteers from the rest of the world. So the result was to import both African slaves, but also Asian slaves, and above all, to make use of the Native Americans. First of all, the ones being close to the mines, who were the ones who were pretty quickly inducted into the quote unquote system, and later on into Native Americans who were living farther afield. Just to give you a sense of the conditions, and again, we can talk about it later on, this is an image from the Valenciana mine in Guanajuato. This is a picture taken by an American mining engineer in 1905, and it shows you what the work entailed. Basically, these are called tenateros, these type of workers, which means these are the guys who went down the mine. So unlike gold mines, which require some superficial digging and taking it to the stream, as we were saying, the silver mines occurred in veins. So basically, they started with some silver outcroppings at the top, and then you had to follow the vein, usually way down. Some of them were extremely deep. So some of the, for example, the Valenciana mine in Guanajuato, the one that this picture is taken from, when it was finished in the early 18th century, it was considered the deepest man-made shaft in the world. And some of these mines were made before the introduction of explosives. So this had to be done by hand. So digging these incredible holes by hand. But that was only the beginning. Then you had to bring up the ore, and you had to do that on these fiber bags that these guys are carrying. They basically put them in these tenates, these bags of fiber that were propped on their forehead. And the reason for that is that they needed to have their hands free so that they could grab onto wooden ladders. And sometimes they were not even ladders, but they were logs that had notches where they would climb up carrying these bags weighing 60, 70, 80 pounds a piece to bring the ore to the surface. And that, again, was not the end of it. Then you had to crush this to a very fine powder, then mix this with various reagents, including mercury, which is a very highly toxic reagent. And that was the way to extract silver. That was the method, the patio method, so-called, to extract silver during much of the colonial period. The idea is that the mercury would bind to the silver, it would sink to the bottom, then you would scrape out the top, the lighter top, and then you would vaporize the mercury, and that you would remain with the silver. Okay, so the result of all of this, as I said, these silver mines required these indigenous communities in the surroundings to be tapped, and when they became exhausted, slavers and mine owners brought Native Americans from a catchment area that eventually existed as far north as California, New Mexico, and Texas. And these connections, these silver connections, so again, I show you the map of the silver mines. The silver mines, there were mines, or there was gold and copper and silver north of what is now the U.S.-Mexico border, but in the colonial period, none of these were discovered. They would be discovered later on in the 19th century. But nonetheless, the silver mines within what is now the territory of Mexico had a strong influence on what is now the American Southwest. And the best example that I can think of that is the so-called Pueblo revolt of 1680. In that year, the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico rose up and launched the most massive rebellion Spaniards experienced in North America since the early days of conquest. And let me show you, so this is New Mexico and Arizona, where the homeland of the Pueblo Indians. The nervous center of this particular movement was the Pueblo of Taos that you can see in the far north and east of the Pueblo world. From inside a kiva, or underground chamber used for ceremonial occasions, a local shaman named Popeye dispatched runners to more than 70 native communities or pueblos, some of them as far away as the present-day Hopi Reservation in Arizona, some 300 miles away. They were not allowed to ride horses, so all of this had to be done by running in the summer, in the punishing heat of the Southwest that many of us are very familiar with. So Papey's plan was very simple, was to get all of these indigenous communities to rise up on the very same day to overwhelm the much smaller Spanish population living in this region. And to this end, these runners carried an extraordinary device, which was a cord made up of yucca fiber containing as many knots as there were days before the insurrection. And so by untying one knot every day, each community would know exactly when to strike. And the revolt indeed swept through New Mexico on August 10 and 11 of 1680, destroying houses, ranches, and churches, and really succeeding mightily. And within 2 months, all Spanish settlers living in New Mexico were either dead or had been driven out of the territory. And in trying to grapple with this incredible uprising, writers have emphasized the religious aspects of the Pueblo revolt of 1680. They have focused on the charismatic Popeye and his ability to coordinate so many pueblos. And these authors have also been rightly impressed by the burning and defacing of churches and the torturing and killing of friars during the uprising. So a disproportionate number of friars were actually lost their lives during this event. And of course, I should start out with a caveat that explaining the motifs of people in remote times from our own, like 1680, is a very dicey business. And of course, rebellions are never triggered by a single cause. However, in my book, I try to make the case that while religion was certainly a factor, along with others, the Spanish enslavement of New Mexican natives played a major role in triggering this massive rebellion. And for one thing, rebellion leaders explicitly talked about this. One of the demands of the rebels was, and I want to quote one of them, that all classes of Indians forcibly held by the Spanish be given back to the rebels. So we have that. One of the rebellion leaders also asked, and I quote him, that his wife and children be given up to him, and likewise that all the Apache men and women whom the Spaniards have captured in war be turned over to them. So we have these testimonies of rebellion leaders explicitly citing slavery as one reason for their insurrection, and I cite a number of examples in my book. But another part of the argument has to do with just the geography of the uprising, which is very suggestive of the importance of the Indian slave trade. Although the uprising is popularly known as the Pueblo revolt of 1680, the movement actually encompassed a large swath of territory along the slaving corridors leading south from New Mexico to the mining region of southern Chihuahua. So I don't know if you can see my arrow, but this little dot here, Parral, was a very significant 17th century silver mine that is a prime example of that catchment area that I was talking about. It drew slaves and people held in bondage from a wide variety of regions, including Toboso peoples from the east, including New Mexican Pueblos and Apaches from the north, Mansos also from the north, and peoples, Pimas and others from the west, from what is now Sonora, that also made their way, or Tarahumaras made their way or were forcibly transported into Parral. Sometimes they were not forcibly transported, but they were held by debts in Parral. So the point is that there is a very clear match between the area in which the rebellion unfolded, and these slaving corridors leading into Parral. So very suggestive. One of the most fascinating aspects of the phenomenon of Indian slavery is the involvement of Native Americans themselves. Native Americans participated in the slaving enterprise since the very beginning of European colonization. However, at first, they played a secondary role to the Europeans, who, after all, possessed the most developed warfare technologies, especially horses and firearms. Indigenous peoples became local suppliers, junior partners, guides, guardsmen, and intermediaries. But with the passage of time, Native Americans came to acquire European weaponry and horses. And as they increased their power, they also came to control a larger share of the traffic in Native Americans. And so by the 18th century and 19th century, they had taken control of much of the business, not only in North America, but we can see the same phenomenon elsewhere, for example, in the Caribbean with the Carib Indians. In North America, no other group attained the spectacular success of the Comanche Confederation of the Comanches, which became the preeminent suppliers of indigenous slaves to both other native groups as well as to European colonists, be that the Spanish or the English or the French in Louisiana. Their expansive territory, which I'm showing you here, wedged between New Mexico and Texas, called Comancheria, became a major trading center, as the work of many historians has amply demonstrated. I'm thinking of Pekka Hamalainen, Brian DeLay, Joaquin Rivalla Martinez, and many others. And of course, slaving was very much one part of this enterprise. So let me just quote you a couple of snippets to give you a taste. According to one witness in 1744, Comanche trading parties traveled more than 1,000 leagues, so 4,000 miles, around 3.5 thousand miles from New Mexico in the course of a year, acquiring captives and returning to offer their loot in the trading fairs of New Mexico. One missionary recorded the enthusiasm caused by the arrival of one of such trading embassies. And let me quote it, just one line. Here the governor and his lieutenants gathered together as many horses, metal tools, and everything possible as they can for trade and barter with these barbarians in exchange for deer and buffalo hides, and what is saddest, in exchange for Indian slaves, men and women, small and large, a great multitude of people. End of quote. So for Comanches themselves, the slave trade was not just a business, but it was a way of life. Comanches sold some of their slaves, as I was describing, but they also retained many of their captives. One witness noted that, and I quote, nearly every family amongst the Comanches had one or two captives. Many of these captives were actually women who were incorporated in Comanche society as secondary wives, sort of like the wife of the wife, so to speak. They were in charge of doing tasks like preparing the hides, curing the hides, and preparing the meat of buffalo. So it required some skill and stamina to kill buffalo. But once that huge animal was on the ground, it required a lot of work otherwise you had a rotting carcass in your hand. So many of these women would put to work in this capacity. And so many of these captives were women who labored in this capacity. Another stream were boys who were also taken into the Comancheria, and their main occupation was to look after the horses and other animals, mules, etc. So as Comanches grew stronger, they accumulated horses and mules, and managing these herds required considerable work. And this is pretty significant work, especially if you think about it, that this is going on year round, especially in the winter. And so boys, 10, 12, 14 were tasked with this very significant work. So for Comanches, as well as other groups, I'm using Comanches as an illustration, but many other groups engaged in this, slaves constituted a very versatile commodity that could be used as an exploited underclass, as pawns that could be exchanged for kin members who had been captured by other groups, or simply as the most ubiquitous form of currency in what is now the American Southwest. Okay, so Indian slavery engulfed the entire American continent, but the timing varied depending on the region. So by the 19th century, Indian slavery had nearly disappeared in the eastern seaboard. In colonial times, the Carolinas, for example, had been a major Indian slaving ground. As again, I could cite several works on this. New Englanders had impressed rebellious Indians and shipped them to the Caribbean. The French colonists in Eastern Canada had procured thousands of natives from the interior, from the Great Lakes region. However, during the 18th and early 19th centuries, the traffic of Native Americans was largely, not completely, but largely replaced and overshadowed by African slavery. Yet, Indian slavery continued to thrive in the West. And the best evidence comes from letters and diaries of westbound Americans. In New Mexico, James S. Calhoun, the first Indian agent of the territory, could not hide his amazement at the sophistication of the Indian slave trade. And let me just give you one quote. "The value of the captives depend upon age, sex, beauty, and usefulness," wrote Calhoun. "Good-looking females not having passed the sear and yellow leaf are valued from $50 to $150 each. Males, as they may be useful, one half less, never more." Similarly, out here in California, California may have entered the Union as a quote unquote free soil state, but American settlers soon described that the buying and selling of Native Americans was a common practice in the Golden States. Well, I mean, it was prior to being a state. As early as 1846, the first American commander of San Francisco acknowledged, and I quote him, that certain persons have been and are still imprisoning and holding to service Indians against their will. And this commander also warned the general public that, and I quote him again, "the Indian population must not be regarded in the light of slaves." His pleas, however, went unheeded. And so the first California legislature passed the so-called Indian Act of 1850, which authorized the arrest of quote unquote vagrant natives who could then be quote unquote hired out to the highest bidder. This act also enabled white persons to go before a justice of the peace to obtain Indian children, quote unquote, for indenture. And according to one scholarly estimate, this Indian Act of 1850 may have affected as many as 20,000 California natives, including 4,000 children kidnapped from their parents and used primarily as domestic servants and farm laborers. So finally, the map that I'm showing you here, Mormon settlers arrived in Utah in the 1840s looking for a promised land, only to discover that natives and Mexicans in the region had already turned the Great Basin into a slaving ground. So the area was and remains like a gigantic moonscape of bleached sand, salt flats, and mountain ranges. And well, at the time in the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries, this region was inhabited by small bands, no larger than extended families. And early travelers to this region did not hide their contempt for these so-called digger Indians, lacking horses and weapons, not realizing that for ecological reasons, it made no sense to keep horses that ate grass on which they themselves depended. So it made more sense to kill them and eat them. But these horseless digger Indians became vulnerable to the mounted Indians coming, especially Utes. And of course, the Mormons and Brigham Young and his followers, by establishing themselves in the area, became the most obvious outlet for such captives. Mormons were hesitant at first, and so they required some encouragement. And so slavers, indigenous slavers, tortured children with knives or hot irons to call attention to their trade, or threatened to kill any child and went unpurchased. Brigham Young's son-in-law, Charles Decker, witnessed the execution of a native girl before he agreed to exchange his gun for another captive that was being threatened with being killed if not purchased. And so in the end, Mormons became buyers and even found a way to rationalize their participation in this human market. Buy up the Lamanite, the Indian children, Brigham Young counseled his brethren, and educate them and teach them the gospel so that many generations would not pass before they should become a white and delightsome people. End of quote. So it was really the same logic that the Spanish conquistadors had used since the 16th century to justify and rationalize their own acquisition of Native Americans. So persistent and widespread was Indian slavery that ending it proved nearly impossible. The Spanish crown had prohibited native bondage under all circumstances in 1542. At the beginning, I was saying how Indian slavery was generally prohibited, but there were a few loopholes. In 1542, those loopholes were closed completely. It was illegal to hold Indians as slaves under any circumstances, yet the traffic continued. To retain mastery over Native Americans, European owners resorted to a variety of euphemisms and subterfuges that amounted to slavery in all but name. Another attempt at abolition occurred in the early 19th century when the newly independent Republic of Mexico proscribed all forms of native bondage and extended citizenship rights to all Native Americans born within the territory of Mexico. Yet Indian slavery persisted in Mexico. One more opportunity, of course, arose in the aftermath of the Civil War here in the United States. Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which, as you can see on your screens, prohibited both slavery and involuntary servitude. And these generous formulation opened the possibility of liberation of Native Americans held in bondage, especially in the West. However, in various rulings in the 1870s and 1880s, the Supreme Court opted for a narrow interpretation of the 13th and 14th Amendments that applied primarily to African Americans and generally excluded Native Americans. As you know, Native Americans only were extended universal citizenship until the 1920s. There were other gains along the way. So Congress passed an act abolishing the system known as peonage, defined as the voluntary or involuntary service or labor of any person as peons in liquidation of any debt or obligation that exists in various Western states. So peonage, after everything else had been banned, Indian slavery had been banned, etc., peonage became the main mechanism for enslavement in the West. And Congress passed the so-called Peonage Act of 1867, outlawing that practice, which was a very important step. But again, even the written word alone could not eliminate practices that had been occurring in the region for centuries. And so forms of native bondage continued through the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. Today, we have tens of millions of people, 45 million people in 167 countries who lived in some form of modern day slavery, according to some of the estimates by the Walk Free Foundation, for example. Slavery is forbidden all over the world, yet not a single region of our globe has been spared from this scourge. And slavery continues to thrive because its beneficiaries resorts to debts or prison sentences or some other subterfuge to compel people to work under the threat of violence and offering absurdly low or no compensation. And so with this growing awareness about the present day slavery, what lessons can we derive from Native Americans' experience with the other slavery, as I call it, during 400 years? It seems to me, first of all, that the emphasis on the newness of the contemporary forms of bondage is myopic. This is something that, of course, some of the superficial ways in which this occurs have explanations that go back a few decades: liberalization, or maybe the end of World War II, or the sex trade involving Eastern European women in Russia, etc. or children in third world countries toiling in sweatshops. All of these are very modern forms of a phenomenon that nonetheless goes way back. The early mechanisms can be traced back all the way to the 16th century, as I've tried to show in this presentation. And only by contemplating this longer trajectory can we gain a measure of the breathtaking dynamism and staying power of this other slavery and the tremendous difficulties of ending it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Resendez. A terrific lecture. Really appreciate you being here and talking about these subjects. We do have some questions in the Q&A feature, and I want to turn to those. So one of our history professors, Enrique Buelna, asks, sometimes some of his students ask, why do we need to know this history? How are the events of this past relevant to me today? And how would you respond to those kinds of inquiries from students?
Well, number one, I would say that I call it the other slavery, meaning that it is different from African slavery, which is what we normally think of as the slavery. But in some ways, this other slavery is the more relevant type of bondage that helps us understand what is going on today in terms of human trafficking. As I was trying to explain, very much as it happened with Native Americans, today there's no place in the world where slavery is permitted, yet it happens through all of these subterfuges in a manner that these Native Americans that I'm describing from the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries would find eerily familiar. And so if you really want to understand the roots of what is happening today, Indian slavery is a very powerful way to find these roots and this continuity and to contemplate something that has been extremely difficult to eradicate. Again, I could go on and on about this, but one of the features is that slavers were extremely adept at changing the terminology. So if Indian slavery was prohibited, then they would have Indians held in deposit, or they would use the penal system. So they would sell not the people themselves, but their service. So there were many legal workarounds to work around the prohibition against Indian slavery, which is something that you would recognize in modern day forms of human trafficking. You are muted.
Sorry, a second question. Sorry about that. Let me turn to Liz Soluri's question, and I'll come back to Enrique's second question. So she's, first of all, thanking you for the talk. And could you speak to the enslavement, forced labor, and reduced rights of indigenous people here in Central and Northern California? For example, the forced relocation and labor at Spanish missions, Russian trading posts, or the effects of the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians from 1850 that was enacted shortly after our statehood here.
Right. Well, for this last one, I spoke briefly about this in my presentation. Yes, this is an area of active scholarship, and there are several books. I'm thinking of Benjamin Madley's recent book and others. First of all, there is a lot of attention on the missions, and rightly so, because missions were spaces of control and coercion. So natives initially willingly agreed to live under the bell, but once they lived under the bell, they could not leave on their own, and corporal punishment was often used, force was often used. So clearly, missions were a site where this occurred. And there is rightfully a focus on missions, in part also because it is emphasized in our own primary and secondary education here in California. However, I find that the situation did not get better with the end of the missions. So the missions were secularized in 1833 with a well-meaning set of laws from Mexico City to extinguish the missions, and the idea was that the the neophytes, so the missionized natives, would be turned into small farmers. The mission lands would be parceled out into small plots of land. These missionized Indians would receive these plots, they would receive some tools, they would receive some training, and they would become small farmers. But of course, that was the theory. In practice, a group of well-connected Mexican politicians, ranchers, etc., took the lion's share of the lands and carved out these large ranches that we are very familiar with, all up and down California, and many of the neophytes were inducted into these ranches as field hands. And so again, they went from a system of coercion into another system of coercion, in which other mechanisms like indebtedness, for example, or protection, became the glue that kept these natives into the ranches. Not only that, but at the time in the 1830s and 1840s, there were many other native Californians who were beyond the mission system, and they were also key to the work being done in these ranches. And so we have records of these ranchers sending slaving expeditions to bring Indians who had not been a part of the mission system and brought into the ranches to work either permanently or sometimes cyclically. So they would be brought in for harvesting or planting season and then released back. And again, we think of nomadic Indians as moving everywhere, but they actually knew in very predictable cycles, meant to take advantage of different foodstuffs that became available at certain times of the year. So the ranchers knew exactly where to find them and bring them back at gunpoint. So that amounted to a kind of a cyclical form of enslavement. So the situation did not get better. Actually, in some ways, became worse after the missions became extinguished. In the 1830s and 1840s. And they reached a climax in the 1850s where, again, great work by Madley and Mike Magliari and others have shown that there was actually a trade a slave trade, especially in children, native children. And this would result in tragic episodes in which slavers would actually go into these indigenous communities, kill the adults, and then take the children to be sold to whoever wanted to purchase them. So the literature is abundant. The examples are quite abundant about this.
Thank you, Dr. Resendez. We have a few more questions in the chat. One is again from Enrique Buelna here. Why is the history of the Native American slavery not had the same attention as African slavery, do you think?
Oof, that's a question that comes up a lot. I think one part of it has to do with just the records. So as I said, Indian slavery was mostly illegal, was made illegal very early on. It was partly illegal and completely illegal since 1542. And as a result of that, if you look at the documents, you have far fewer documents about Indian slavery than you have about African slavery. African slavery, you find it in bills of sale because it was totally legal. You find it in wills being passed from one generation to another. And moreover, African slaves had to cross the Atlantic in order to get here. And so you have a very meticulous record and obsessive counting along the way of these slaves. So you have a lot of records about those. In the case of Indian slavery, because it was illegal, you don't have the same kind of record. Because they were both procured and consumed regionally, you don't have the same meticulous accounting. However, you do have very continuous records or references to slaving raids, to people getting afoul of the law because of their illegal slaving, et cetera, or accusations of such things. So there are records, but not quite as good as African slavery. So that would be one. But more fundamentally, I think, is because we have had a conceptual stumbling block in looking at Indian slavery, and that is because it was made illegal then the colonial administration, or the colonial, or rather the owners of Indian slaves, in collusion with crown officials, devised a variety of terms to obfuscate what they were doing and to retain mastery over their natives. And so they resorted to encomiendas, which were encomiendas, repartimientos, peonage, and there were many other terms that are more regional, naborias, etc., nijoras, etc. So it has taken us a while to put together all of these different categories and to figure out that this is just colonial obfuscation. We really need to use, so whereas African slaves are identified as such readily in the case of Indian slavery, we really need to do this conceptual work of teasing out what is actually Indian slavery and what is not. And not everything is. And I could go on and on about let me just say before we move on to that, to me, I mean, because I had to count them, as I said, I provide estimates of the number. To me, 4 main criteria defines what is an Indian, who counts as an Indian slave and who doesn't count as an Indian slave. And one is that typically these individuals were forcibly transported from one place to another. They were not kept in the same place, in part because if you were using slaves from a group that lived immediately right next to your property, you opened yourself to retribution from these groups. So these type of slavery, for it to work, they had to move them from one place to another. Number 2, once they were in the work site, owners resorted to either violence or the threat of violence to get them to work. Number 3, these native slaves could not leave the place of work at will. And number 4, they were sometimes paid. And so some scholars tell me, oh, but they were paid, so they were not slaves. Well, but the payment was often either in kind, so for clothing or food, or it was so below the market that it was mostly symbolic. And so really the payment was way below the market. And that is the 4th characteristic that defines, what the other slavery, in my mind at least, and is met by many of these bondage arrangements that we have been talking about. Sorry for the extended answer.
That's helpful. Thank you. The next question is from one of our trustees, actually the trustee of our board, asking you to expand on your closing comments and elaborate on them. And I think you were trying to say that when we focus on the newness, for example, of slavery or modern examples of it, we forget the long history of what has happened. And particularly, we're not paying enough attention to the other slavery that you're talking about. Maybe you can elaborate a little more.
Sure. I think there's nothing, when we talk about the modern day slavery or modern forms of enslavement, there's really nothing modern about this. The mechanisms of coercion used, debts, imprisonment, all of these things have been there all along. And there's really nothing new about this. In fact, it kind of takes away some of the urgency and a sense of the difficulty of stamping out such practices, because this is something that has been going on in this continent, well, I mean, before contact, but in ways that we would find it more or less recognizable since the 16th century. And we have yet to eliminate it significantly. So I think I think it's, and as I was beginning to say, maybe only by contemplating the craftiness and the resourcefulness of the slavers do we get a sense of what we're up against. So changing of the terminology, as we were saying, or for example, when authorities clearly saw that slavers were targeting one particular indigenous group, they simply changed the region or changed and started targeting a different indigenous group in the same way that modern slavers may target one particular vulnerable community. And when the law enforcement agents get too close to that, they simply switch to another region, another province, another group to target. So these are, again, techniques that are true and tried and have been around for centuries. That's the main point that I was trying to make.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We have two more questions, and I think we'll wrap up. There's a question from Shirley Flores Munoz about, first of all, thanking you for being here, for your research and your systematic approach. Can you give us a brief outline of your new book and when it might be available to purchase? What is your topic for this week's UC Davis History Conference? And again, appreciate your generous sharing tonight from Shirley.
Thank you so much. Well, so first of all, let me start out with the second, which is the shortest one. The topic is very similar to this one, meaning the other slavery on free labor in the Americas, from the 16th century on to the present. My next book, I should say that after 7 years of researching this book and writing it, it proved to be a very somber, kind of an enterprise. And so I wanted to find something positive. And I became very early on fascinated by the extreme difficulties of opening up the Pacific Ocean. We often think of the Pacific as just another ocean like the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, but in fact, it is different. It is so much larger. It is the shape of the Pacific Basin is a flattened circle or an oval, which makes it especially difficult for individuals who are trying to go from the Americas to Asia and back. Unlike the Atlantic, which is like an S, it's in the shape of an S, snaking between the Americas on one side and Africa and Europe on the other, which means that the shores are relatively close to one another. And so the topic is the very first expedition that managed to go from the Americas to Asia and back, and the sort of Columbus of the Pacific, so to speak. The Columbus of the Pacific turns out to be an Afro-Portuguese man, not a white European, even though the overwhelming majority of the naval officers were white. This man was so extraordinary that he rose through the ranks until becoming a licensed pilot, which is the highest occupation that somebody in his position could ever attain. So anyways, it's an exciting story. It's a story of scientific achievement, of great human hardship and triumph at the end. So a very different story from the one that we are discussing tonight.
Well, thank you. Sounds like a terrific book. I can't wait to see it. The final question we have is from Emmy, and the question relates to, well, I'll read it. How was the practice of bringing Indigenous people into the mission at gunpoint ever not viewed as slavery? And I think you would characterize it as perhaps slavery. How was it not seen as slavery? First of all, there are different cases, but typically the way it would work was that the missionaries would arrive in an area. They would give out food and resources that became interesting to the natives living around. And so there would be an initial period of negotiation in which different groups would decide whether they wanted to go and live under the bell or not, willingly. Now, I have to preface this by saying that missionaries never came alone. They also came with presidios, as we know all too well in California. So these are military outposts as well, which were also sites of enslavement. And so you can imagine if you're an indigenous group living out in the far northwestern frontier of New Spain, you had to make a calculation. Is it safe for us to stay and become prey to individual slavers, or is it better to go into the mission, use these new food sources and live under the protection of the friars, even though there will be some discipline and eventually corporal punishment also inside this. So it is I don't want to oversimplify it. It was a complicated decision on the part of different groups, and again, cases differ depending on the cases, but basically, if you were an indigenous group out here, you were caught between a hard rock, two very difficult circumstances, and you chose the mission
because you perceive that as the lesser evil, even though in the long term, it may not have been such a great decision.
Well, Dr. Resendez, I really want to thank you for your willingness to be here. It's been a terrific talk and educational for us, many of us. So, and I must say, I'm so appreciative of how quickly you responded to the request to come and talk to us here at Cabrillo. So I want to thank you personally for your commitment to your research and also to your commitment to public education and being here tonight with us. Thank you so much.
As I said, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It is a wonderful opportunity, and good luck with your process.
Thank you very much. That's actually the wrap up for our educational series of lectures for the name exploration process. As Trustee Cuevas said earlier, we will move towards a recommendation potentially in the fall semester about where we will go next with this process. But it's been a real pleasure having the series of talks that we've had this spring and a great way to have an anchor session with you, Dr. Resendez, tonight. I want to remind folks that we do have the survey for you to complete. If you'd like to complete that, I've been putting that in the chat box towards the end of the talk here. But again, if you'll join me, a round of applause for our guest speaker, Dr. Andres Resendez. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Beatrice, did you have a question? I'm sorry, I saw your hand go up. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Matt.